Provost. It's my privilege to welcome you here to this third of fourth series, a lecture in a series of lectures through the CFL, the Center for Faith and Life. The Center for Faith and Life was launched this year as a means to advance our work in faith and integration. And we hope that through the work of the Center for Faith and Life, we can equip faculty and students for courageous work in the world. To lead our work in the center, Geneva sought a scholar who doesn't just study the integration of faith and learning, but has lived it out at the highest levels of Christian higher education for over 3 decades. Dr. Jim Spiegel has served as the executive director of the Center for Faith and Life since August of 2025. For over 25 years, he served as a professor of philosophy and religion at Taylor University, where he didn't just teach in the classroom, but he also led their ethics bowl team to 5 regional championships and also a national title. Most recently, he has served as a John Templeton Research Fellow at Hillsdale College and as the executive director of the Kalos Center for Christian Education and Spiritual Formation. Dr. Spiegel holds a PhD in philosophy from Michigan State University and MA from the University of Southern Mississippi, and of specific interest to those of us in the sciences, a BS in biology from Belhaven University. But Dr. Spiegel is perhaps best known as a prolific author. He has written or edited more than 10 books that tackle some of the most pressing questions of our time, with titles such as The Making of an Atheist, How to Be Good in a World Gone Bad, or The Benefits of Providence. His work has appeared in everything from scholarly journals like Metaphilosophy to popular outlets like Christianity Today and The Federalist. Dr. Spiegel is a man who finds God's truth in the everyday, whether he's exploring the philosophy of the Beatles, or analyzing contemporary film, or co-authoring the Wisdom and Folly blog with his wife Amy, who is with us. Jim's work is marked by a belief that everything is art because everything belongs to the great artist. Today's lecture is the third of 4 in a series based upon his upcoming book project, A Thing of Beauty, How Everything is Art and Art is Everything, which is slated for publication later this year. Please join me in welcoming a scholar, an author, and the director of the Center for Faith and Life, Dr. Jim Spiegel, as he presents Human History and Divine Drama.
Thank you, everyone. So, as Dr. Stevens noted, this is my 3rd lecture in this inaugural Center for Faith and Life lecture series. Here's a quick review. In my first lecture, I presented a theological case for what I call the divine art paradigm, or DAP for short. Okay? So if you hear me use the word DAP, I'm referring to the divine art paradigm. This is the idea that the entire cosmos is a genuine work of art and that God is a literal artist. In that talk, I also explored some implications of this thesis, including how we should think about divine creativity and educational categories. And in my second lecture, I further established the conceptual foundations for the divine art paradigm, or again, DAP, by considering some philosophical grounds for this view. I explored several major theories of art: mimetic theory, formalism, communication theory, the expressivist theory, and I found that the divine art paradigm is not only compatible with each of these major definitions of art, but it also generates significant insights when applied to them, specifically concerning our understanding of divine providence and divine emotion. In the remaining 2 lectures, I want to explore the implications of DAP in more detail, beginning with the study of history, which on the divine art paradigm is properly understood as systematic reflection on the human drama, God's theatrical production as it unfolds on planet Earth. So, two views of history. A major debate in the philosophy of history regards the question of purpose. Does human history have an ultimate goal or meaning? Are world events driving towards some intended end? That is to say, is history teleological? To answer negatively is to affirm the nihilistic perspective, which is the view that history has no overarching purpose or meaning, but is rather just a temporal stream of contingent events. This view rejects any notion that history is advancing towards some objectively better or higher state. There's no final predetermined end towards which events are ultimately leading. Or as British historian Arnold Toynbee supposedly said, history is just one darn thing after another. That's censored a little bit. While particular players on the world stage have plenty of aims, goals, and purposes, the human drama as a whole is basically pointless on this view. A major proponent of historical nihilism is Friedrich Nietzsche, who says, quote, all events in the organic world are a subduing, becoming master, and all subduing and becoming master involves a fresh interpretation or adaptation through which any previous meaning and purpose are necessarily obscured or even obliterated, end quote. So while Nietzsche rejected any notion of history as a purposeful narrative, he did believe discrete historical events can be explained or understood, specifically in terms of the ubiquitous urge to grow and dominate, which he calls the will to power, that's inherent in all living things. A century later, the same historiographical approach would be most forcefully deployed by the French philosopher Michel Foucault, who saw human history fundamentally in terms of power struggles. Thus, like Nietzsche, Foucault regarded history, people, events, institutions, as intelligible, but he repudiated any notion that history has an ultimate purpose or objective meaning. The teleological view of history takes a fundamentally different perspective than that of Nietzsche and Foucault, affirming that world events do have an ultimate purpose and meaning. However, the teleological perspective comes in two basic forms, humanistic and theocentric. According to the humanistic version, the march towards history's goal is driven by human reason in the form of our own ideas and collective achievements. This view is epitomized by Immanuel Kant, who envisioned a universal cosmopolitan state as the final destiny of humankind. This he saw as the coming, quote, realization of a hidden plan of nature to bring about an internally, and for this purpose also an externally perfect national constitution, as the sole state in which all of humanity's natural capacities can be developed, end quote. Kant was confident that this universal cosmopolitan state, the womb in which all of the human species' original capacities will be developed, will at last come to be realized, end quote. A very different, but no less humanistic brand of historical teleology was advanced by Karl Marx. Despite his atheism, Marx was as convinced as Kant that history is inexorably progressing towards a socio-political fulfillment of human reason. For Marx, this will involve a proletariat revolution where the working class seizes control of the means of economic production. This will bring about a dissolving of class distinctions, the abolition of private property, along with all of the bourgeois class exploitation this entails, and the withering away of the state. The final end will be a classless society where all scarcity, alienation, and oppression is abolished, and resources are distributed, quote, from each according to his ability and to each according to his need, end quote. This will mean universal self-realization, quote, an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all, end quote. Marx regarded this as no mere utopian dream, but a guaranteed outcome given his economic materialism, which he innovatively combined with the dialectical logic of George Wilhelm Hegel. As for Hegel, he affirmed a theocentric version of the teleological view of history, arguing that, quote, the history of the world with all of the changing scenes which its annals present, this process of development and the realization of spirit, only this insight can reconcile spirit with the history of the world. That what has happened and is happening every day is not only without God, but is essentially, not only not without God, but is essentially his work, end quote. And the point of that work, the final end at which history aims, is divine self-realization, says Hegel. A full and complete self-understanding of absolute spirit, which is God. A theologically orthodox version of the theocentric teleological view of history is perhaps best represented by Augustine, whose perspective is grounded in the notion that God created all things out of nothing and is the sovereign governor of all things. Consequently, says Augustine, quote, if he were, so to speak, to withdraw from created things his creative power, they would straightway relapse into the nothingness in which they were before they were created, end quote. This means that all world events, however random or wicked, are under God's providential control. And as for the ultimate aim of history, God is wisely guiding human history towards a joyful eschaton, the new heavens and the new earth under the kingship of the Lord Jesus Christ, where there is no more pain and suffering, but only everlasting joy. Augustine exults, quote, how great shall be that felicity which shall be tainted with no evil, which shall lack no good, and which shall afford leisure for the praises of God, who shall be all in all, end quote. So those are different views of history, nihilistic and teleological. Now, 4 views of providence. Christians obviously must reject a nihilistic view of history and affirm that God has certain purposeful aims when it comes to the human story. So we should be specifically theocentric teleologists when it comes to history. We must likewise reject the humanistic teleological view, if only because any notion that history is rational or progressing towards a higher, better state begs the question why this is so. Any teleology, whether in the context of athletic shoes, automotive function, computer technology, or complex human achievements, implies a purposeful intelligence who crafted the design, coordinating means and ends. So to insist, as Kant and Marx do, that the whole of human history is moving inexorably toward an ultimately rational telos is a thesis that can only be sustained by recognizing that the entire story is governed by an all-powerful, consummately rational being, God. So a theocentric perspective is the only reasonable version of a teleological historiography. Now, granting a theocentric teleological view of history, this leads us into several important questions regarding divine providence, the doctrine of God's control of the world. There's a wide variety of perspectives, differing according to how much divine control of the world they admit. On the Calvinist view, God meticulously controls all of creation, including every event throughout history. As John Calvin puts it, God so regulates all things that nothing takes place without his deliberation. Therefore, quote, there is no erratic power or action or motion in creatures, but that they are governed by God's secret plan in such a way that nothing happens except what is knowingly and willingly decreed by him, end quote. Thus, divine foreknowledge is downstream from God's foreordination. And since God is the creator of time itself, both God's determination and knowledge of cosmic events are eternal, transcending time. Critics of Calvinism complain that the view precludes human moral freedom and makes God directly responsible for evil in the world. Thus, they opt for a view of providence that relaxes the concept of divine governance of the world. One such view, known as simple divine foreknowledge, affirms God's exhaustive foreknowledge, but sees this as logically prior to his determination of historical events. Proponents of simple divine foreknowledge maintain that God governs world events on the basis of his knowledge of future events. Thus, by rejecting divine foreordination of all things, simple divine foreknowledge aims to safeguard human freedom and shield God from responsibility for the world's evils. A major problem with simple divine foreknowledge concerns the fact that since God knows the future exhaustively, this means he is powerless to change or otherwise meaningfully affect future events. And since what God knows about the future cannot be otherwise. So if he knows it in advance, that means it's certain. That means he can't change anything once those moments arise. So it really handcuffs God. It's a major problem with simple divine foreknowledge, a view that would be held by people like John Wesley and Jacob Arminius. The Molinist view was devised to overcome problems plaguing Calvinism and simple divine foreknowledge. 16th century Jesuit theologian Louis de Molina appealed to what he called divine middle knowledge to preserve a strong sense of divine providence and human freedom while shielding God from responsibility for human sin. Molina proposed that from eternity, God reviewed all of the worlds that he could create that contained free beings. He considered all of the choices that they would make in each of those possible worlds. And then he decreed the one that was best overall. Consequently, according to Molina, God is perfectly sovereign, yet also blameless regarding the world's evils. Moreover, God can work out the entire plan for the world without violating human history. Without violating human freedom as they act in history. Unfortunately, Molinism faces difficulties of its own. Most notably, the grounding problem, which concerns the lack of any metaphysical basis or grounds for God's knowledge of the counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. For all of their differences and unique problems, these three views of providence have some important features in common. First, they all affirm exhaustive divine foreknowledge, which in turn is based in the fact that God transcends time. Consequently, God knew all world events, including free human choices, prior to creating the cosmos. This means God could never be surprised by anything that happens in the world. Second, God sovereignly governs the cosmos, whether directly, as in Calvinism, or indirectly, as in simple divine foreknowledge and Molinism. God is in full control of all the particulars of world history. And thirdly, God's purposes in history are guaranteed fulfillment on all three of these views. His final redemptive aims for the world will be achieved. There is absolutely no risk that his ultimate purposes will be thwarted. The fourth major view of providence rejects each of those points. Open theists maintain that God is essentially temporal, experiencing time much as we do. Moreover, they believe that human freedom precludes the possibility that God has exhaustive foreknowledge. God initially created the world and human beings, thus actively initiating human history. But from there, God permits history to unfold without controlling the details. Openness theologians sometimes call this containment sovereignty, emphasizing divine responsiveness. As Richard Rice says, quote, providence involves God's creative response to events as they happen, end quote. All of this entails the notion that God takes risks. David Bassinger puts it like this, quote, God is a risk taker in the sense that he commits himself to a course of action without full knowledge of the outcome. And God is a risk taker in the sense that he adopts certain overall strategies. For example, the granting of significant freedom, which create the potential for the occurrence of events that he wishes would not occur, end quote. And on the open theist view, many historical events do occur that God neither wills nor even anticipates. So, views of providence and the divine art paradigm. Each of the four views of providence are consistent with the divine art paradigm insofar as each can readily affirm that God is in charge of the drama we call human history. They seem to differ from one another just in terms of how much of the drama, if any, is left to human improvisation. Open theism maximizes human freedom and plays down divine providence, while Calvinism maximizes divine providential control and minimizes human freedom. The other two views aim to achieve a certain balance. But let's look more closely. My purpose here is not to settle the debate among these views of providence, but rather to apply the divine art paradigm to them in order to illustrate how each naturally fits with DAP and to explore how the views differ in terms of the artistic metaphors their distinctive conceptions of providence entail. In another work, my work on providence, I do I attempt to settle the debate. So if you're interested in more there, you can check that out. It's a defense of a high view of providence. It's called A New Look at Divine Sovereignty is the subtitle. So my purpose here is not to settle that debate, but to see how these different views of providence apply to the divine art paradigm, or how DAP applies to them. Consider the Calvinist view of providence. Given DAP, this view features an author who meticulously governs the human drama. The parallels between God and a human author hold consistently, which arguably serves to dispel concerns about human freedom and divine responsibility for evil. Here's why. Although the author of a novel meticulously governs the story's events, dictating all of the words and actions of the characters, the author is not culpable for their immoral actions, however evil they might turn out to be. Consider an author such as Victor Hugo, who planned all of the immorality in Les Miserables and dictated every diabolical action and word of the arrogant legalist Javert. Despite this, Hugo is entirely innocent of that man's wrongdoing. Javert is the wicked one, not Hugo. And we make a category mistake in blaming Hugo for Javert's vice. Furthermore, relative to the timeline of the novel, Hugo absolutely transcends time and is capable of conceiving the entire story all at once. Knowing the end from the beginning, Hugo knows all of the novel's events because he first planned them. As the sovereign author of the novel, Hugo did not first foresee what he would write in order to know it or decree it. Rather, he foreordained it all in the form of planning the details of the story, thus fully determining the content. Hugo's authorial decrees are the basis of his knowledge about the story, not vice versa. Consequently, Hugo guarantees the outcome of the story. There are no risks involved at all as regards the fates of any of the characters, for Hugo is in complete control. The story will fulfill his aims to the extent that his authorial skills allow. Molinism features an author who governs his story a bit differently. To illustrate with Les Miserables again, Hugo considered all the events and characters that he might create, including all the characters' choices. Hugo then selected the characters and events that together conduce to the best possible story relative to the overarching themes, grace and redemption, that he hopes to display. Unlike the Calvinist picture, Hugo's determinations of characters' words and actions are not flatly determined ex nihilo, but decreed according to what Hugo believes each of the characters would choose were they placed in their various life situations. Of course, in order to know what a given character would choose in a particular case depends upon their unique nature and moral character, which Hugo would first have to determine. For this reason, in the end, Calvinism and Molinism look very similar from the standpoint of the divine art paradigm. Both fit very naturally with the conception of God as the sovereign author of the human story. The simple divine foreknowledge view features an author who exercises much less control over world events than is affirmed by Calvinism or Molinism. Given a simple divine foreknowledge perspective, Hugo determines the events of Les Miserables on the basis of what he knows will happen in the story. Thus, he foresees what the characters will do in the story and decrees their words and actions accordingly. This naturally raises the question how Hugo could know what the characters will say and do without first determining these things. Here, the simple divine foreknowledge proponent might point out that using the novel genre is unfair to this view of providence, since it keeps the author temporally transcendent outside the timeline of the story. A more appropriate art form for thinking through simple divine foreknowledge would be theater, where the characters are in time. It's on the basis of their genuine agency that the characters' words and actions can logically precede the playwright's knowledge of these things. Here we must imagine an omniscient director who knows what the characters will do and say in advance. Open theism features a theatrical director who governs most permissively, resulting in a world that is essentially improvisational theater, not just from the perspective of the actors, but even from the director's point of view. Consequently, neither the particular actions of the characters nor the exact final outcome of the story is absolutely certain. In this way, the story is much more like an athletic event than a novel or a closely scripted theatrical production. As with simple divine foreknowledge, the characters are placed in an initially determined context, but the plot that emerges is mostly up to them. However, as the plot develops, the director is free to introduce various props and other external influences to guide the story in the desired direction, so long as the characters retain their moral freedom. Still, given the free agency of the character, or of the characters, there is no guarantee that the story will turn out as the director prefers or even as he expects. The director may be surprised and disappointed by the outcome, but such are the risks and hazards of improvisational theater. No one can know in advance how it will turn out, nor even how a given scene will unfold. We may conclude then that all four views of providence welcome a view of God as artist, though there are significant differences among their particular conceptions of the kind of narrative. The Calvinist and Molinist views most naturally welcome the metaphors of a novel or a thoroughly scripted play, while simple divine foreknowledge and open theism best fit with the metaphor of improvisational theater. The main differences between them being the amount of control and advanced knowledge the director possesses regarding the character's choices. And these divergent perspectives each turn on a variety of issues, including biblical exegesis, definitions of human freedom, and a priori intuitions about divine attributes. But despite these disagreements, proponents of all views of divine providence may readily agree that God is the author or director of the human story, and his artistry is profoundly evident throughout this drama we call history. Okay, history as tragicomedy. If human history is a divinely orchestrated drama, then we may ask, what kind of drama is it? Two basic dramatic forms are comedy and tragedy. Each takes a variety of forms. As classically defined, a comedy, such as Aristophanes' The Frogs or Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, depicts a heroic character's triumph over difficulties, whereas a tragedy, such as Sophocles' Oedipus Rex or Goethe's Faust, depicts the hero's final downfall. Thus, sometimes people ask, is history essentially a comedy or a tragedy? Maybe you've wondered the same thing. While there are proponents of the notion that history is essentially one or the other, this may be a false dichotomy. Instead, some insist that comedy and tragedy are the twin masks of history. This recognition of both comedic and tragic features suggests that history must be best viewed as a tragicomedy, incorporating significant elements of both dramatic forms. Classic tragicomic plays include Plautus's Amphitryon and Shakespeare's The Tempest. Films that fall into this category include O Brother, Where Art Thou?, The Royal Tenenbaums, and Inglorious Bastards. All of these plays and films creatively blend comedic and tragic elements and culminate in an ending that is at least hopeful, if not genuinely happy. Each, we might say, is ultimately a comedy marked with significant tragic elements. Now, given a Christian theological perspective, does human history qualify as a tragicomedy in this sense? Let us first consider the tragic aspects of redemptive history. Throughout the history of ancient Israel, we encounter numerous catastrophic events, including the fall of man, the worldwide flood, Egyptian enslavement of the Jews, recurrent and extreme Jewish defiance of Yahweh, the murder of many prophets, the corruption of numerous kings, the Babylonian captivity, the desolation of Israel, extreme Roman oppression, and ultimately the slander, betrayal, torture, and murder of the Messiah. These are all tragic elements. There are many comedic aspects as well, including the raising up of Abraham, Moses, and other patriarchs, the miraculous deliverance of the Jews from Egyptian captivity, Israel's possession of the promised land, David's slaying of Goliath, Esther's becoming queen of Persia, the arrival of the Messiah, and Christ's miraculous bodily resurrection. Granted, these are just episodes of biblical history rather than world history as a whole. Human history generally is replete with both tragic and comedic events. And in any case, if biblical history constitutes the central narrative of history that is determinative of the general redemptive plan of history, then that is sufficient to define history's overall redemptive arc. This is because the gospel story has comprehensive reach, promising redemption both at an intimate personal level and at a global historical level. Personally, the gospel promises and delivers complete redemption and salvation for each individual who turns to Christ. The gospel also delivers a comprehensive global redemption in the form of a new earth, where all of the redeemed dwell in permanent peace and unity under the glorious reign of the world king, Christ the Lord. This everlasting eschatological triumph is more than enough to establish the prevailing comedic element of human history. But there's another often overlooked way in which history is comedic, given the centrality of the gospel story. This concerns the many deep ironies, paradoxes, peculiarities, surprising twists that characterize it. Irony is a standard device in comedic literature, and the fact that the gospel story is full of irony enhances its comedic nature. It is peculiar, even paradoxical, that the infinite, eternal God should take the form of a finite human being, that he should be born to a virgin, that he should assume so humble a position during his earthly career, practicing a simple trade like carpentry, that he should be despised and rejected by the very people he created, especially those who were religious experts, that he should be accused of the gravest of sins and condemned as a common criminal, that he should die the most humiliating of deaths, naked before a mocking crowd. Even more paradoxical is the fact that this would be God's ordained means of salvation for a sin-sick world, that he should defeat death by his death. These are the bizarre ironies of our faith. C.S. Lewis regarded the ironic quality of the Christian worldview as one of its most convincing features. He says, quote, "It's a religion you could not have guessed. If it offered us just the kind of universe we always expected, I should feel that we were making it up. But in fact, it's not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have." End quote. The gospel is certainly not what one would expect, which is why the disciples had no inkling that the slain Jesus would rise again. They were surprised at every turn, just as we would have been. It's certainly not a story any mere mortal might have dreamed up, which is a mark of its truth. But it's more than true. It's good news. News so good that it must appear to be a lie. For the redemption it provides is absolutely complete. J.R.R. Tolkien called this quality, which is directly the opposite of tragedy, eucatastrophe, turning dramatically upward at the conclusion. A eucatastrophic tale offers consolation that is perfect, a happy ending. For just this reason, the Christian gospel is both strange and hard to believe, much like a fairy tale. Tolkien writes, quote, "It has long been my feeling, a joyous feeling, that God redeemed the corrupt making creatures, men, in a way fitting to this aspect as to others of their strange nature. The Gospels contain a fairy story, or a story of a larger kind, which embraces all the essence of fairy stories. They contain many marvels, peculiarly artistic, beautiful, and moving, mythical in their perfect self-contained significance. And among the marvels is the greatest and most complete conceivable eucatastrophe," end quote. Indeed, the gospel story is mythical insofar as it's wildly imaginative and supernatural story that seems too good to be true. Some people will actually say that, skeptics about the gospel. You'll sometimes hear people say, that just seems too good to be true. Yet it's historical fact. It's not just one important truth, it is truth with a capital T. The verity of verities, the central story of history. In all its strangeness, the true myth lies at the core of human meaning. Though seemingly nonsensical, it must be embraced for sense to be made of all human knowledge and endeavors, from science and politics to sports and theology to lovemaking and war. Finally, kill the dragon, get the girl. It's been said that the gospel can be summed up in these 6 words: kill the dragon, get the girl. That's the plot line of some of the greatest fairy tales and mythologies. There is, for instance, the story of Perseus and Andromeda in Greek mythology. The trouble starts when Andromeda's mother, the queen of Ethiopia, brags about how beautiful her daughter is, even more beautiful than the sea nymphs. When the sea nymphs complain to the sea god Poseidon, he unleashes the sea monster Cetus to ravage the Ethiopian coastland. So Andromeda's father, the king, appeals to Zeus, who tells him that he must sacrifice his daughter Andromeda to satisfy Poseidon's wrath. The king agrees, and Andromeda is chained to a rock on an island to be devoured by Cetus. Perseus has his own heroic backstory, but he eventually happens upon Andromeda chained to the rock. He immediately falls in love with her and proceeds to slay the nasty beast. After a bit of family drama, Perseus and Andromeda are married, they have a bunch of kids, and they live happily ever after. Sort of, it's complicated. Then there's the story of St. George and the Dragon, a Christian adaptation of the same myth set in ancient Cappadocia. A vile dragon has made a practice of extorting the local villagers who regularly give up their livestock and possessions to him. After they run out of possessions, they begin making human sacrifices, and eventually Princess Sabra becomes the next sacrifice. The princess goes willingly, figuring it's necessary for the sake of her village. But the noble St. George happens upon her as he's heading for the dragon's lair. He sees her crying and asks her why. Sabra explains and tells him to flee. He refuses, slays the dragon, saves the village, and gets the girl. These classic fairy tales are thrilling and deeply satisfying, perhaps because they are metaphors for the basic truths, or the basic truth about human history. And the Bible tells that story. It's the ultimate story of kill the dragon, get the girl. The Bible's dragon slayer plotline is plain enough, starting in the early chapters of Genesis, where we learn that, quote, the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made, end quote. That's Genesis 3:1. He deceives the woman, leading to the tragic downfall of humanity. That same satanic serpent figure appears repeatedly throughout biblical history, mercilessly tormenting Job and playing the part of the adversary and accuser in 1 Chronicles, Ezekiel, and Zechariah. He plays a critical role in the betrayal of Christ as he enters into Judas in Luke 22. But everything changes as our Lord rises from the dead. In the final chapters of the book, we are told, quote, he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil, or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And the devil was thrown into the lake of burning sulfur, end quote. That's Revelation 20. Thus, our dragon-slaying Lord turns tragedy into triumph, converting catastrophe into Tolkien-esque eucatastrophe as he gets his girl. Rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given to her to wear. That's Revelation 19. That girl is the church of God, also known in Scripture as the bride of Christ. And the wedding, which signifies the most intimate union between God and his people, is the happy ending to this true fairy tale. Thus, kill the dragon, get the girl is the basic plot line of Scripture and human history. Our omnipotent knight defeats our satanic enemy, even killing death itself, uniting us to himself, and then he celebrates it all with a massive feast. The gospel story is essentially dramatic in the dark hours of, or it's especially dramatic. In the darkest hours of human history, it appeared that the dragon had won the girl. The girl was a goner, and all hope was lost. The knight, after all, was dying. Who would have thought that the two most incredible things would happen? That the knight would come back to life, but also that the death of the knight would be the means of saving the girl. This actually takes the kill the dragon, get the girl motif to a uniquely different level. Resurrection stories make great drama, which is why they figure so prominently in fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen, Brothers Grimm, Disney films such as Beauty and the Beast, Jungle Book, Frozen, many other popular films including Star Trek III, The Dark Knight Rises, among many others. In some films, the entire gospel story is mimicked. Consider E.T., the extraterrestrial. There are spoilers here, but you've had time to see this film. A visitor from another world appears who is wise, compassionate, loving, and morally pure. He gathers disciples, literal children, and radically transforms their lives. However, E.T. and his disciples are persecuted, and eventually E.T. is killed by corrupt authorities. But when all seems lost, E.T. miraculously rises from the dead, rejoins his disciples, and eventually ascends to the heavens. But only after promising that he will remain with them in their hearts. Puts his finger on little Elliot's heart. Right, this is where I'll be. The E.T. plotline strikingly parallels the story of Christ, even down to the miraculous resurrection and ascension of the central Savior character. And not because the writer, Melissa Matheson, or director, Steven Spielberg, were devout Christians intent on making a film that echoed biblical themes. No, their goal was simply to tell a great story. It just so happens that the best possible plot line is the eucatastrophic gospel arc. Another Hollywood great, director George Stevens, summed it up well when he titled the story of Jesus, "The Greatest Story Ever Told." Great storytellers understand this intuitively, which is why their own stories so often parallel the greatest story. They can't help themselves. Because we love narratives and because we dwell as characters within the narrative of history, God gave us the gospel in the form of a story, a strange tale of remarkable irony, complete with wild plot twists, devastating downturns, and exhilarating upswings. In these ways, the gospel story is like human life itself, both individually and corporately. We rise and fall and rise again. In Christ, the God of history guaranteed the final movement would rise rather than fall, that the last upswing of our story would be everlasting. And so it shall be, by the grace of the God who killed death, whose death and miraculous return made life eternal for millions. And we shall live happily ever after. Happily ever after. Thank you. Okay, questions? We got time, I think.
If you raise your hand, I'll get a mic.
As with the last two lectures, thank you very much for your time and preparation. Just very interesting, fascinating ideas. I look forward to reading your book whenever that's published this year. I had a clarification question just about DAP. So if DAP is reflective of the nature and design of reality, what ultimate epistemic framework does it best fit? You explain its coherence with 4 different views, but what is the cosmological fit of DAP? In other words, what underlying truth does DAP best reveal, considering the 4 categories aside from the authorship of God?
Great question. So did you attend my first lecture? Yes. Okay. So I get into kind of the foundations for this in that first chapter and then develop it more in the second lecture. And I think we can arrive at DAP, the divine art paradigm, biblically as well as philosophically, and this is further reason to do so because our best understanding of what art is and our understanding of God as running everything, it just, I think, implies it directly. But then it raises questions. I don't know if I'm answering your question right here, but are you concerned about, are you interested in knowing, what what I think is the best fit in terms of view of providence with DAP?
I think ultimately, yes, but in general, just what's that underlying core truth that's uniting all of this? Because presuppositionally, there has to be something ultimate, and ultimately it can't just be these axiomatic claims that fit with 4 different categories. So what's that very underlying uniting nature?
Good. Yeah, the ultimate fount of all of this is a serious and robust view of God as creator, okay? And there are certain basic intuitions we have because we're made in God's image regarding beauty. We're all drawn to beauty. It's one of the 3 transcendentals: truth, beauty, goodness. And this book, by the way, will be I'm writing a trilogy. The others one devoted to the good, and another one devoted to truth. But a basic concept of beauty, which, by the way, the Bible does talk a lot about, and divine artistry, grounded in God as creator. So that's the basement of this whole thing, is a robust biblical view of God as creator. And it has all these implications for everything from history to science to marriage, spiritual formation, work, everything. I hope that helps. Right here.
How did you come to, I guess I should first ask, would you say that the divine art paradigm is one, like, that is a lens through which you see everything now. So, like, not only do you have described it, but you also live it.
That's great. I can't put it any better than that. So it is a lens through which I see everything now. I don't just describe it, I live it or try to live it. I certainly see myself as a character on God's stage, like you are. Here we are, right? And we're interacting, and he causes us to bump into one another. You got all these props that, are means by which he gets our souls to interact. And it's all ultimately for God's glory. And what brings him glory is the growth, you might say the spiritual evolution of his image bearers, right? You and I were growing right now in terms of understanding and relating to, others in the world. And it's all beautiful. It really is this massive mosaic, this drama that God is authoring. So, yes, and it is so edifying to me, particularly, I think you'll find it edifying too, when you go through hard times in life, understanding God's artistry and goodness. When you hit one of those bottoms in life, as we all do eventually, you think, if you have DAP, if you have the divine art paradigm, this is part of the story. I'm in the middle of the story, and what kind of dramatic move is he going to make next? If I'm submitting to him, and I'm not one of the wicked, right? I'm imperfect, but submitting to him, he is going to bring this thing back up. So it reinforces faith at a profound level. And that's where, man, where the rubber hits the road. How can I be encouraged by this and driven to deeper kind of obedience and submission to God? And this does it.
Thank you for your work, Dr. Spiegel. This is just a question about the term eucatastrophe. Is that Tolkien's effort to kind of describe what he considers that paradoxical or ironic combination? Or maybe you could elaborate a little bit about what exactly he means by eucatastrophe, like what's catastrophic about it? In other words,
So a theologian friend of mine, actually the president of Indianapolis Theological Seminary, just gave him a shout out. It's a great seminary, Reformed Seminary in Indianapolis. Nicholas Piotrowski, we were talking about this at a recent conference. He said, why isn't it just comedy? Why call it tragicomedy or eucatastrophic? And I think what Tolkien's really emphasizing there is just how deep the tragic components are. You can have, let's say, run-of-the-mill catastrophe like Romeo and Juliet. I mean, it's bad. But it's not as bad as the God-man taking it like he did, right? The murder of the Messiah. It seems utterly hopeless. The worst kind of catastrophe. And then the greatest possible upswing, right? What could be more hopeful than the gospel? Even if you've been a Christian for decades, like I have, it will hit you anew. Like, wow, is this really true? How can the news be so good? So I think what Tolkien wants to stress there is that it's the depths of the catastrophe and the heights of the upswing. And his concern is to show that the gospel does fit the fairy tale or mythical structure.
Last question over here. Oh, we're out
of time. Okay,
Sorry.
Well, if you want to linger, I can talk to you, but you've got more learning to do, so thank you.